The mystery of the old lighthouse. The gale whipped through the rocky face of Blackthorn Point, bearing the brininess of the ocean and the bite of a chill that seemed to seep right through the bone. 5 friends stood beneath the weathered stone tower of the old lighthouse, the building's crumbling stone looming above them like a forgotten sentinel. The building stood as a relic, abandoned for decades, its once bright beacon a vacant socket gazing blankly at the horizon. Local legend said it was haunted by the ghost of Keeper Elias Morrow, a man who disappeared under mysterious conditions a century ago. The townsfolk of Havenport would speak of strange lights flickering in the tower at night, of moans on the gale, and of shadows moving without a cause. The lighthouse was a ghost story to Mia, Lucas, Sophie, Ethan, and Ava, but it was also a challenge. Mia cinched her backpack straps, her flashlight casting shadows through the gloom. "We're doing this," she declared, firmness ringing in her tone even as her hands shook. "One night in the lighthouse. No chickening out." Her dark eyes snapped from friend to friend, challenging them to object. Lucas, his lanky form unfolding from his slouch, grinned nervously and pushed his glasses upward on his face. "You sure about this, Mia? My grandma says this building's cursed." Sophie, wrapped in a heavy scarf, rolled her eyes behind their lenses. "Your grandma thinks everything's cursed, Lucas. It's just a creepy old building." Ethan kicked a pebble at the door of the tower, his eyes skeptical. "It's probably just rodents and faulty pipes making those noises." Ava, the most reserved of them, held onto her sketchbook close, her eyes on the dark windows of the lighthouse. "I don't know," she whispered. "Something feels off." The challenge began as a joke at a slumber party, conceived out of tedium and excessive scary stories. Havenport was a quiet beach town, and the lighthouse its only claim to notoriety. Spending a night within its confines was the ultimate challenge of nerve, a rite of passage nobody their age had ever tried. They were 17 and old enough to think they were invincible, yet young enough not yet to be wise, and no one would be the first to show fear. The door creaked open as Ethan pushed it, and they found themselves staring at a spiral staircase vanishing off into darkness. The flashlight beams tangled in dust motes dancing in the air, and the sense of mildew and metallic undertones of old blood filled their nostrils. The group followed each other in, their feet echoing off stone walls as they moved inside. The space inside was cramped and small at the bottom, with a narrow keeper's room containing a rickety table, a broken chair, and a fireplace full of ash and debris. Cobwebs hung in corners like tattered drapes. "Cozy," Sophie tried to make light of it, but her tone came out fragile. They ascended the stairway, the iron steps creaking beneath their weight. The farther they climbed, the chillier it became, as if the lighthouse itself exhaled winter. At the upper level stood the lantern room, its huge glass panes fractured and beclouded. The machinery of the beacon rested idle, rusted into silence. The panorama was magnificent, ocean stretching off forever to the horizon, but the room seemed oppressive, as if the walls were shut in upon them. As darkness fell, they spread sleeping bags on the ground and attempted to settle in. Lucas drew out a deck of cards and proposed a game as a way of passing the time, but nobody could concentrate. Outside the window, the wind increased in intensity, banging on the panes like a living creature attempting to come in. And then a noise, a slow, rhythmic thudding, almost like footsteps on the stairs. The group tensed, flashlights flicking on at the door. "It's the wind," Ethan tried to reassure them, but his tone trembled. The thudding halted and a softer scrape began, like fingernails on stone, echoing off the walls. Ava's sketchbook fell from between her fingers, and her eyes went wide. "Did you hear it?" she breathed. No one could answer before a shadow passed over the glass of the lantern room, a fleeting but unmistakable figure of a man, hunched and unmoving, observing them. Mia's flashlight probed the room and found nothing but their own reflections staring back at her. "There's nobody here," she muttered, speaking as much to herself as them. The space seemed thicker now, charged with an unseen energy. They agreed they would investigate, hoping movement would diffuse the unease. The keeper's room below yielded a frayed rug and a trapdoor beneath it, a cellar below. The hatch creaked in protest as they levered it open, a heavy weight requiring effort. A reek of dankness and sourness pervaded their nostrils as their flashlights picked out a narrow stairs descending into darkness. "We must look," said Mia, her fear yielding to curiosity. Lucas shook his head. "No way. That's how horror movies begin." Peer pressure got the better of them, and they went down single file into the darkness. The cellar was tiny, and the walls glistened wetly. A stone table in the center bore strange symbols carved on it which seemed to throb in the beam of the flashlight. It had a rusty knife on it, blade encrusted with darkness. Sophie gasped, taking a step away. "This isn't right," she whispered. "We should escape." As she uttered the words, the trapdoor overhead slammed closed, and the darkness enveloped them. Their cries reverberated through the space, but the lighthouse seemed to absorb the noise, so only silence, and the slight, unmistakable breathing behind them, were left behind. Panic spread through the group as their flashlights flashed erratically, casting wild beams on the cellar's wet stone walls. The breathing grew louder, a rasping inhalation seeming to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. Mia hammered on the trapdoor, but it refused to move, as if held shut by an invisible hand. "Help!" she cried out, her voice muted by the stone. Ethan added his weight as well, ramming his shoulder against the wood, but it would not give. Sophie grasped Ava's wrist, her fingernails digging in as Lucas frantically manipulated his flashlight, repeating under his breath, "This isn't happening, this isn't happening." The breathing suddenly ceased and a low thrum replaced it, a faraway chant. Ava aimed her flashlight at the stone table, and the symbols glowed softly as if they glowed from their own internal light. "Look!" she breathed, her own voice shaking. The symbols were sharp and strange and unlike any they recognized. The knife on the table began to vibrate, and the blade seemed to ripple the light so the knife blade appeared almost alive. "We must be on our way," said Sophie, her gaze flicking toward the trapdoor. Before anyone could take a step, however, the air chilled and a figure formed in the corner, a tall, hunched shape with empty eyes that reflected like oil slicks. The group recoiled, pressing themselves against the wall. The figure did not move, yet it seemed to be draining the heat from their bodies as if by sucking it out of their flesh. "Who are you?" Mia demanded, her words trembling but firm. The figure cocked an eyebrow and a voice, like dry leaves, whispered, "You shouldn't be here." The words seemed to burrow through their heads rather than their ears. Ava's sketchbook slipped from her grasp as her hands shook so badly she could not hold it any longer. "He's here," she whispered. "The keeper." Pale as chalk, Lucas stammered. "Elias Morrow? He's dead!" The eyes of the figure flashed, and the thrum in the atmosphere grew stronger, resonating in their chests. The trapdoor slammed open, letting dim lights seep into the cellar. They ascended the stairs without pause, heart racing, not daring look behind them. The shadow of the keeper did not move behind them, but they knew it was present, a pressure on their minds. In the keeper's room, they slammed the trapdoor closed and placed the smashed chair on top of it, as if a pile of furniture could hold whatever was down there at bay. "What just happened?" Ethan demanded, his doubts shattered. "A ghost? A hallucination?" No one replied. Sophie sobbed quietly, holding her knees, and Ava stood by the trapdoor, her eyes far away. "It felt real," she said. "Too real." Mia, attempting to take command of the situation, proposed they look for signs in the keeper's room. If this would be haunted, then there must be a motive, she claimed. They searched through the rubble and came upon a dusty journal behind the fireplace. The skin on the book was cracked and dry, the pages aged and crumbling. The script was shaky, written in 1893, signed by Elias Morrow. The entries painted his life as a lighthouse keeper, solitary nights, ceaseless storms, and a rising fixation on the ocean. The passage caught their attention. The voices at night call from the deep. They speak of power at a price. I must resist. As they sat reading, the wind raging on the other side of the door grew louder, and the scratching came and went from the keeper's room walls. Ava turned the final entry over, her hands shaking. I can resist them no longer, it said. The ritual has been fulfilled. The light may not shine ever again. The words chilled them through and through. Ritual? Lucas whispered. What ritual? Before they could wonder, a crack from the lantern room above reverberated through the building as if glass broke. They took their flashlights and went up the stairs in a surge of fear and curiosity. The room in the lantern house was chillier than previously, the air heavy with the scent of ozone. One of the huge glass panes had split a little farther, webbing from a single center, as if whatever had hit it came from inside. Etched on the floor below the window was a symbol like those found in the basement. A broken spiral of sorts that seemed to twist when stared at for too long. Sophie shone her flashlight at the ceiling, gasping. Etched on the metal there were words. The light is their prison. Who's they? Ethan whispered. No one replied, but the roar from the cellar came back louder, followed by a soft sheen on the stairs. Mia seized the journal and began flicking through it wildly. A loose sheet tumbled out of it, a map of the lighthouse and the cellar indicated, and a scribbled annotation, binding circle, written alongside it. Elias did something here, she muttered. Something to enclose. Whatever those things are. The glow intensified and the hum became a chorus of urgent, but unintelligible whispers. Ava's pencil grasped in her hand began to move on its own, drawing the spiral symbol. It's calling me, she muttered far away. Lucas seized her wrist. Ava, stop it! Her eyes were glassy and stared straight at the symbol. The air trembled and the keeper's shadow materialized once more at the boundary of the lantern room, the empty eyes staring at the two of them. You cannot depart, the keeper's shadow whispered, and the lighthouse rocked as if the sea itself were rising up to take them away. The lighthouse shook, the stones grinding as if the earth below were moving. The friends cowered in the lantern room, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls as the murmurs escalated into a chorus, a cacophony of 1,000 voices speaking simultaneously. The keeper's figure stood perfectly still, its eyes aglow with unnatural light. Mia gripped the journal in a white-knuckled grip, and Ethan struggled to open the door of the lantern room, which seemed to lock behind them somehow. This building wants us here, Sophie wailed, her scarf falling from her frantic hands. Lucas stood between Ava and whatever danger might be present, and sketched on a sheet of paper without heed of the chaos around her, even though her face seemed a mask of emptiness. Stop her! Mia cried out and leaped at Ava's sketchbook. She snatched it away from her and brought Ava out of her daze. Ava blinked in bewilderment, and screamed when she caught sight of the shadow. It's in my head, she wailed, holding her temples. The form of the keeper wavered as if fighting to hold on to its shape, and the words became a sharp stinging. Release us. End the circle. The atmosphere became thick and heavy and pushed at their chests, making breathing a struggle. She opened the journal a second time, having sought the answers here. The drawing of the binding circle indicated the stone table in the cellar and the surrounding symbols, which now glowed softly on the floor of the lantern room as well. Trapped something here, she whispered, shivering. Something from the ocean. Ethan continued struggling with the door, but his bluster wavered now. What, like monsters from the sea? This is crazy! But those words on the ceiling, the light is their prison, towered above them now, undeniable as a threat. Lucas recommended shattering the symbols on the cellar floor in the hope of weakening whatever confined them. If it's something Elias has bound, perhaps shattering the circle will prevent this. Sophie negated his statement. Or make things worse. What if that's what it desires? The shadow advanced, blurring at the edges and the hisses taking on a desperate quality. Free us, they whispered menacingly, and the broken glass pane trembled on the verge of shattering totally. With no alternative, they made their way down to the keeper's room, skirting the cellar's trapdoor. The journal also described a secondary entrance to the cellar behind the fireplace. Ethan and Lucas shoved the heavy stone away and found a slanting tunnel beneath. The air inside reeked of salt and rot, and the drone was overwhelming, resonating through their very bones. We can't go in there, said Sophie, but already Mia was crawling through it, compelled by a desire to make sense of it all. We must, she said. If we don't, we'll be stuck here forever. The tunnel brought them to the cellar, but from another direction and showing a wider chamber than they were used to. The stone table stood there, its symbols burning brighter, thudding like a heartbeat. 5 stone columns ringed it, each one carved with a face, human but deformed, with empty eyes and open mouths. The knife on the table glittered, blade now spotless as if the discoloration had been sucked away. Ava gasped and pointed at the columns. They're moving, she whispered. The faces shifted and changed from pain and sorrow to anger. The shadow of the keeper materialized once more, at the edge of the table this time, the voice a menacing growl. What has been done cannot be undone. Mia paid it no mind, reading from the journal. The ritual was explained. A bargain had been made between Elias and forces from the ocean, promising them freedom for a share in his power. He betrayed them, however, and subjected them to the symbols and his own blood. The light, when activated, held them prisoner, but it hadn't burned in a century. That's why the beacon's dead, Lucas realized. He broke it so they'd remain here. The whispers escalated into screams and the pillars shook, their surfaces rent asunder by developing fissures. Sophie pulled on Mia's arm. We must leave at once! The tunnel behind them came crashing down as stones tumbled deafeningly and blocked their way. The shadow cackled a dry, rasping laugh as the knife on the table lifted off and levitated in space. Ava let out a scream as it aimed at her, and the blade shone menacingly. It's hungry for blood, she whispered as she took a step back. Ethan picked up a loose stone and prepared to defend himself, but the shadow merely stood and watched as the eyes glittered maliciously. Mia's face set in a determined look. The symbols, she said. If we shatter them, perhaps it unbinds. Lucas hesitated. But what if we let them loose? The faces on the columns opened mouths, and their cries grew louder as they seemed to suck at the air. There was no time to argue, and Mia picked up the knife, its handle icy to the touch, pounded it on the table, chipping at the carvings. Sparks flew and the shadow let out a roar as it began to destabilize. The others joined in and began hammering at the carvings with stones, each blow silencing the hum a little more as the final symbol fractured. The cellar rocked hard and the shadow disappeared. The dying screams were replaced by a chilling silence punctured only by the creak of the trapdoor above admitting a faint light. They emerged, racked and gasping, but the lighthouse now seemed changed, alleviated as if some weight had shifted from it. However, as they made their way to the keeper's room, Ava stood rooted, pointing at her sketchbook lying on the ground. The pages were covered in sketches of the deformed faces, each and every single face staring upwards at them, their eyes far too real. The friends staggered into the keeper's room, their breathing harsh. the silence of the lighthouse oppressive after the bedlam of the cellar room. The air was still chill, but the crushing pressure relaxed a little now that the destruction of the symbols released some hold from a bygone era. Mia held the journal close, its pages now dry and fragile as if years elapsed in a matter of moments. Ava's sketchbook lay open on the ground, the drawings of the faces of the pillars staring upward with unnatural vitality. Sophie would not glance at it, her gaze locked on the steps to the lamp room. "We must leave here," she croaked. The front door creaked and would not move, and the windows were out of reach. Ethan, who was still holding on to a stone from the cellar, proposed examining the lantern room once more. "Perhaps a means of escape through the top," he said, however his tone was not convincing. Lucas nodded, but Ava hesitated as her eyes flicked toward the sketchbook. "They're still here," she whispered, tracing a line toward the drawings. The faces changed as their mouths curved into soft smiles. Mia shut the book and pushed it deep into her backpack. "Don't look at them," she said. "They're getting inside our heads." They ascended to the lantern room, their weight causing the creaking stairs. The shattered glass pane now gaped open, glittering pieces on the floor. The spiral mark on the metal softly glowed, pulsating like a dying star. The journal said the beacon would be the key to the binding, but it sat rusted and dead, gears stuck in place. Lucas stared at the machinery, his hands shaking. "If Elias destroyed the light so he could trap those things, maybe restoring it will keep them away," he said. Ethan snorted. "You think we can repair a century-old lighthouse at midnight?" A passage explained the beacon's strength. "The light is their prison, powered by the keeper's will. Without it they agitate." Mia read as a level tone. "Elias must have destroyed it so the ritual wouldn't completely fail." Sophie scowled. "But we broke the symbols. Isn't that enough?" As if in response, the lighthouse rocked once more and a low moan came from beneath it, like the ocean itself protesting. The pictures in Ava's sketchbook, still in Mia's backpack, appeared to stir, as if they were trying to break free from their pages. They scoured the lantern room for anything to repair the beacon, and behind a rusty panel they discovered a small crystal, cloudy but unbroken, which fitted into the core of the beacon. Lucas, a tinkerer at heart, set about aligning it, as Ethan and Sophie removed debris from the gears. Ava stood vigil, keeping a watchful eye on the staircase from which shadows appeared and disappeared just below their level of perception. The moan increased in urgency, and the atmosphere cooled rapidly so their breath missed it. As Lucas inserted the crystal, a flash of light exploded and the beacon thrummed, the gears grinding as they came to life. The room fell into a pale, flickering dimness. The light itself was off, greenish and jaundiced, not like any natural light at all. The moan escalated to a scream, and the spiral on the ground blazed, their lines twisting like snakes. The keeper's shadow materialized once more, this time at the center of the space, his form clearer now, his face a racked mask of anger. "You cannot contain us," he spat, and the pieces of glass on the ground levitated, floating like knives. Mia seized the journal, crying out, "Keep going!" Lucas pushed harder, sweat forming on his brow, as Ethan and Sophie supported the gears. The light increased in intensity, but so did the looming presence of the shadow's eyes burning into them. Ava shrieked as her sketchbook tumbled through Mia's backpack and opened on a fresh drawing, a perfect sketch of the keeper's face twisting in pain. "It's not him," Ava whispered, her voice cracking. "They're both here. The things he trapped." The light stabilized on the beacon, illuminating the room in a chill glow. The shadow let out a roar as it frayed at the edges and the glass pieces dropped, tinkling harmlessly. The moan dissipated and the light on the symbol died away. They believed they'd succeeded for a moment. The light wavered and the keeper's whisper came on a sigh of words. "The debt is not paid," The journal in Mia's grip began to heat, and the pages themselves began turning of their own accord to a final blank page now inscribed in a single red mark. Blood. The lighthouse trembled once more, and the door below creaked open, as if calling them away or challenging them to remain. They dashed down the stairs, not halting until they were at the edge of the slope out on the coast. The sea lay quiet now and the wind was still, but the lighthouse stood behind them, its light casting a pale, otherworldly glow. Ava held her sketchbook close to her, sobbing openly. "We didn't trap them," she whispered. "We just awakened them." As they ran toward Havenport, the light of the lighthouse flashed once, and then disappeared. The ocean churned away in the distance, and a low thrum echoed behind them, a threat of return. They stumbled into Havenport at dawn break, the heavens a bruised purple above the ocean. The lighthouse stood quiet on Blackthorn Point, a dark shadow on the horizon. Mia, Lucas, Sophie, Ethan, and Ava slumped on the pier, their clothes glistening with sweat and sea spray. No words were spoken, their heads reeling from the terrors of the night, shadows of the keeper, writhing symbols scattered on the rocks, the nauseating light from the beacon. Ava gripped her sketchbook, 20 or so pages now heavy as if drenched in a substance thicker than any ink. The buzzing from the lighthouse resonated in their ears, soft but insistent as a heartbeat in the distance. They promised each other they would not speak of the night, dreading being told they were lying, or worse, calling the things they awakened from their slumber. The pull of the lighthouse proved impossible to resist. Mia hid the journal in her attic, the pages a daily reminder of the crude spelling of the word blood, in crimson. Lucas immersed himself in research, combing the library in Havenport for mention of Elias Morrow, finding only general reports of his vanishing and gossip of a shipwreck in the same year. Sophie shunned the ocean, her nightmares tormented by faces without eyes. Ethan attempted a joke about it, but his hands trembled as he walked by the cliffs. Ava refused to draw, her sketchbook shut away, the pages far too terrifying to face. Weeks passed and the lighthouse didn't stop tormenting them. At night they heard the buzz, clearer when the tide came in high. Shapes crossed their line of sight, always flicking away when they moved their heads. Mia awoke in her attic to the journal lying open on a patch of dusty floor, the pages flipped to the diagram of the binding circle, now scribbled through with new scratches. The window of her room stood open on a moonless night when she awoke to find the scent of decay and salt and a soft whisper. "The debt is not paid." Ava broke first. She gathered the group before her, her face white as a sheet, her hands shaking as she opened her sketchbook and revealed its contents. The drawings had shifted, different faces, more defined now, their eyes tracing the onlookers. "They're returning," she whispered. "We weakened the cage, not destroyed it." Ethan snorted, but his fears seeped through his bravado. Lucas wanted them to go back to the lighthouse and destroy the beacon once and for all, but Sophie would not hear of it. "We almost got killed last time," she said firmly. "Going back would be suicidal." Mia, fueled by a sense of responsibility and a desire to be rid of it, persuaded them to give it a try. "If we don't," she said, "they'll pursue us forever." They went back to Blackthorn Point on a moonless night, the lighthouse darker now, its windows set like empty eyes staring out over the sea. The door stood a little ajar, waiting. The air inside was heavy, the thrum now a rumble. The keeper's room was as it ever was, but the cellar door a little open, a pale green glow seeping from beneath it. They ascended the lantern room initially, planning on destroying the beacon. The crystal remained in position, however, and the gears were smeared with a greasy black material and reeked of decay. As Lucas leaned in to grasp the crystal, the shadow emerged, not only the keeper now, but the keeper and variations of it, their faces resembling Ava's drawings. "You owe us," they whispered as a chorus of anger, their mouths forming a single entity. The lighthouse trembled and the ocean raged nearby, the waves crashing on the cliffs as if called upon. Mia opened the journal, reading the last passage aloud. The debt is blood, paid by the keeper or those who disturbed the circle. The shadows closed around her, their forms hardening, their hands reaching out. Ethan brought a wrench down on the beacon, crushing the crystal. The light blazed out and then went out, and the shadows wailed, their forms dissolving away. The hum did not cease, it increased, and the lighthouse creaked and the stones cracked. They sprinted into the cellar in a desperate bid to ruin the stone table. The pillars were missing and were replaced by puddles of black fluid bubbling and hissing. The knife rested on the table and glowed a deep, fiery red. Ava's glassy stare went out for the blade as she whispered, "The only way." Mia tried grasping her hand, but Ava proved quicker. She brought the knife down and slashed the palm of her hand upon the table. The buzz stopped and the darkness disappeared, but Ava fell on her face and stared blankly. They took her out, the lighthouse quiet but heavy with presence. Ava healed, but she was changed, saying little, her eyes far away. The lighthouse was boarded over by the town as unsafe, but the thrum persisted in their dreams, and the ocean never quieted again. Mia torched the journal, but its words pursued her. The debt was paid, but for now only. Deep in the darkness, the things they freed waited patiently and hungrily for the next keeper to fail. Nightmare alive. Elias awoke in a gasp, his heart beating wildly as if trying to beat a path through his chest. The darkness around him was oppressive, punctuated only by the heavy silence of 3 a.m. He lay wrapped in sweat-dampened clothes, and his own hands shook as he searched for the bedside lamp. Light flickered on, casting hard shadows through his cluttered rooms. Dream psychology books littered the ground at his feet, pages bent and tattered from his own recent fixation. He rubbed his eyes and tried to clear the lucid fear of the nightmare still clinging to his skin like wet mist. He ran through a forest of gnarled and leafless trees whose branches curved like grasping bone fingers. A low thrum of a sound filled the air, not exactly a voice but not silence at all. Something pursued him, unseen but tangible in every sense of his body, a presence aware of his name and his terrors and his darkest secrets. He had caught his foot on a root and fallen, and as he did so the earth split open and a chasm of writhing inky black opened beneath him like a hungry maw. The darkness formed faces in it, eyeless and smiling faces that whispered his name as a chorus that ran a shiver down his skin. He awoke as the earth began to close over him. Elias kicked his legs off the bed, his feet landing on the chilled hardwood floor. He needed to move, to be awake. The apartment stood in oppressive silence, a silence as if on hold. He staggered to the kitchen and filled a glass of water from the tap and drank it straight down. The microwave's clock showed 3:02. He looked at the window and hoped for the dim outline of streetlights, but the glass was misted over as if someone's breath from the other side of the glass lay upon it. He swiped at it with his shirt and saw nothing but the deserted street below. He attempted to brush off the dream as stress-induced. Work as a graphic designer had been tough of late, with looming deadlines and a manager who appeared to thrive on his own stress levels. This dream was different, however. It wasn't merely vivid, it was sensory. He could even now sense the coarse bark on the trees, the slush beneath his feet, the heavy pressure of that unseen stalker. He winced and shook his head, telling himself it was nothing but a dream. Just a dream. The next day, Elias trudged into the office, his eyes bleary from lack of sleep. The office itself was a drab maze of cubicles, the buzzing of the fluorescent lights a continuous annoyance. He sat at his workstation, gazing at his current assignment, a poster for a local gallery show. As he tweaked the color levels, he saw something strange. In the corner of the photo, where a blank space should be, stood a smudged figure of a tree. He zoomed in on it, his stomach nodding. It was a tree, gnarled and branchless, like those from his nightmare. He rubbed his eyes, thinking it a glitch, but when he opened the file again, the tree vanished. The dream came back that evening. The forest itself seemed darker, the buzzing louder, and the entity closer. He ran until his lungs burned, but the trees closed in on him as if moved by an unseen force. He found himself in a clearing where a single, enormous tree stood, its trunk thumping like a heart. The earth beneath it split open, and once more sprang the same faceless faces, their murmurs now a deafening roar. He awoke screaming, his claws grasping at the sheets. As he flicked on the light, he stood immobilized. There on his forearm lay a pinkish-red scratch, raw and shallow-looking, as if some branch had lanced against him lightly. He gazed at it aghast. He hadn't ventured out of the apartment all day. There were no buildings nearby and hence no leaves or any branch he could possibly brush against and cause this sort of scratch on himself. It caught his breath when he recollected the dream, the instant he touched a jagged branch when he ran. He paced for the next hour, attempting to justify it. Maybe he'd scratched himself in his slumber. Maybe he was exhausted and waking things up in his mind. The scratch was just too exact, too tangible, however. He pulled out a book on dream psychology and opened it to a chapter on lucid dreaming. It did mention hypnagogic bleed, where heavy dreams might transfer over as physical perceptions, but nothing about actual marks on his skin. He slammed the book closed, and his hands trembled. By morning he was afraid to sleep. He called in sick and disregarded his boss's angry voicemail and sat on the sofa nursing a cup of coffee and gazing at the window. The glass was misted over once more, but this time he could see faint outlines through the condensation, deadly-looking curves, like twigs. He frantically wiped the window clear, but the outlines reappeared a few moments later. He stood his ground, his heart thumping as he almost dropped the cup and let it shatter on the ground. Elias did not realize it yet, but the line between his nightmares and reality started fraying. The forest, the faces, the presence, they were not limited to his dreams any longer. And whatever pursued him was closing in on him. 2 days without sleep for Elias. The familiar clutter of his apartment now seemed oppressive and confining, a prison rather than a comfort. The atmosphere hung heavy with an unnamed threat, as if the very walls were observing him. The scratch on his arm was a little better now, but when he touched the spot, it smarted and hurt and reminded him of the impossible. He'd pulled bed sheets over the windows so he wouldn't see the strange, branching forms continuously developing in the condensation on the glass. And even with sheets on the windows, at night he heard soft scratches and sounds of twigs tapping on the glass. He'd attempted to divert himself through work, but his computer began malfunctioning. Programs he hadn't touched would spring open by themselves and present him with pictures of empty woods or grotesque faces that disappeared when he attempted to capture them as screenshots. His phone wasn't any better. Text he didn't even recall sending would show up in his outbox, full of nonsensical words that sounded ominously like what he'd heard in his nightmares. He'd ceased answering calls for fear of what he might be hearing. The nightmares changed. They were not just vivid anymore, they were relentless. Any time he closed his eyes at all, the forest waited for him. The trees stood taller, their branches sharper, and the feeling of presence a certainty now. He saw it last night, a shadow moving against the breeze, humanoid but off, longer-limbed, the head a void except for a great, lipless mouth. It did not pursue him any longer. It waited silently, and the silence of it was far scarier than any noise ever could be. The worst dream occurred last night. The clearing found him, and above him towered the huge throbbing tree from previous dreams. The earth beneath his feet was soft and wet, like moist clay, and his stride made a sucking sound as he moved. The shadow loitered at the clearing's edge stationary, the open jaws extending wider as the earth started to break and shift. Fingers protruded from the ground, gray and icy, closing around his ankles. He tried desperately to escape, but those hands were powerful and dug themselves deeply into his skin. Waking found him bruised and tender on his ankles, the imprints exactly what those dream hands would look like if they gripped his skin in real life. He sat on his couch, a notebook on his knees, scrawling down everything he could recall about the dreams. He'd heard it might be a way of gaining control over them, possibly even diminishing their reality. The act of putting them on paper seemed perilous, though, as if it imbued those images with life. He'd written half the notebook full of drawings of the trees, the shadow, the faces. The more he wrote down, the more he realized patterns, recurring phrases in the voices, repeated as, "You open the door," and, "We see you now." He didn't understand what they were trying to tell him, but they filled him with a primordial fear. He went to the library seeking answers in books greater than his own collection. The library itself was a squat brick building downtown, filled with dusty books on psychology, folklore, and the occult. The texts were consulted by Elias for hours, his hands shaking as he flipped pages. He came upon mentions of dream bleed, an infrequent occurrence when dreams and the waking world intersected and were associated with trauma or supernatural forces at work. A tattered old book on ritual discussed a threshold entity, a creature who existed between realities and who subsisted on fear and used dreams as a portal. The detail of formless, watchful presences chilled Elias's blood. The library became quieter as he read, the other readers diminishing in the periphery of his consciousness. The lights flickered and a soft vibration thrummed through the air, reminiscent of the vibration from his dreams. He glanced up, his heart hammering in his chest, and saw a shadow cross the far corner of the room, too large to be a person. He blinked and it vanished, but the vibration persisted, thumping through his chest. He closed the book and fled from the library, his steps echoing through the suddenly deserted building. Back at his flat, Elias attempted to remain alert through coffee and blasting music, but his body betrayed him. His eyelids began to sag, and the room fuzzed at the periphery. He pinched himself, slapped his face, anything to keep himself conscious. The hum returned, louder now, from behind the walls. He staggered off to the bathroom and splashed cold water on his face and halted when he caught sight of himself in the mirror. His eyes were bloodshot, but not good enough. His pupils were dilated too much, almost consuming the irises, and for an instant, they weren't his eyes at all. They were empty, like the faces in the chasm. He stepped back and bumped a glass, which fell on the tile and broke. The hum decreased to a chorus of murmurs calling his name. He dashed through to the living room and snatched up his notebook, and his knees went weak as he looked at what he'd sketched, the shadows of the trees, and his own drawing of the shadow and the faces, moving, their lines changing as if they were liquid ink. The mouth on the shadow spread out on the page and his own handwriting formed a single word on it. Closer. 3 days without ever venturing from his apartment. The world outside seemed a threat, as if opening his door would permit the darkness to draw a little bit closer. The phone lay silenced on his nightstand, the computer cord pulled out of the socket, and the windows shut and curtained over. The apartment was a sanctuary and a jail cell. The droning sound persisted now, a low buzz emanating from everywhere and nowhere. It pursued him even as far as the bathroom and kitchen, and even his closet as he attempted to hide away from it. Sleep now became a danger rather than an option. He hadn't written in the notebook since the drawings shifted. He talked his thoughts out now, dictating them onto an old voice recorder he retrieved from a drawer. Speaking kept his feet on the ground, or so he tried to tell himself. He talked about the dreams and the shadow and the bruising on his ankles and the single word on the page. Closer. He'd barely gotten the words out without his voice catching and stammering and his throat constricting and aching. He hadn't listened to the tapes. He didn't dare. The ritual manual on his coffee table had sticky notes stuck between its pages. He'd read every line from front to back, trying to find anything at all that might explain what he was experiencing. The part about threshold entities chilled him the most. It explained them as old, parasitic creatures who attached themselves to a mind and used their dreams to make the boundary between worlds thinner. When the boundary became weak enough, the creature could travel through, dragging their reality with them. It warned in the book that resisting it would mean battling the fear it thrived on, but he didn't know what to do about it. All he'd ever found was fear. He began noticing differences in the apartment. The walls were softer and less sharp-edged, like a painting left outdoors in the rain. Things shifted when he didn't look at them, a mug on the counter and then on the floor. The air had a musty smell of wet earth, like the forest in his nightmares. The worst were the mirrors. He covered them after catching sight of his reflection's shifting eyes, but at times he could almost hear voices behind the glass, soft and urgent, speaking his name. Last night he nodded off momentarily, sitting on the couch holding the recorder. The dream came on instantly, whisking him away to the forest without warning. The shadow stood close at hand, its mouth distended in a hideous grin. It did not move, but the trees did shift toward him, their limbs stretching toward him like needles. The ground thrummed and the faceless heads pushed through it, their voices now a cry. "You opened the door." Elias sat up with a jump as the recorder continued on even after he'd snapped fully awake. He rewound it and listened, and his own voice came through, but so did another, a low gurgling buzz that uttered words he did not recognize. He realized he was out of time. The book said a ritual would expel a threshold creature, but it involved going willingly into dreams and engaging the creature on its own ground. The very idea soured his stomach. He was not a brave man, only a designer. The other option would be far worse. The bruise on his ankles spread and formed delicate branching patterns resembling veins. He felt as if his skin did not belong on him. It belonged on someone, or something, else. Elias chose to attempt the ritual. The directions in the book were cryptic, explained as if the reader were already familiar with the consequences. He must establish an anchor in order to remain grounded in the waking world as he slept. He used a little silver ring his mother had given him years before as a gift, one of the few tangible things he hadn't lost in his troubled life. He placed it on a piece of twine and buckled it around his wrist as a reminder of the waking world. That evening, he sat on his bed, the ring pressed firmly against his skin. He placed the candle and lit on the small flame as the book instructed, and muttered the words given, words of supplication, words of command for the entity to manifest itself. His words trembled as he compelled himself onward. The buzzing increased in intensity, the atmosphere thickened, and his eyes grew unfocused. He did not recall closing his eyes but found himself in the forest as if in a dream. The shadow hovered at the perimeter of the clearing, its shape now clearer and more defined, its lips a hungry void. The trees whipped about, their branches grasping at him, and the earth shuddered. The ring dug hard into his wrist as he held it, and his voice barely above a breath whispered, "You're not real." The shadow cocked its head as if intrigued, and the ground fissured open. Black hands came up from below, not gray now but black, their fingers ending in claws. They lunged at his legs and pulled him down, and the shadow moved in closer, its lips opening wider. Elias shrieked, pulling on the string at his wrist. The ring seared his skin, and in a jolt, he found himself returning to his apartment, and the candle's weak flame. Something was off, however. The walls were filled with branching patterns, just those on his skin, and the buzzing drowned him out. The shadow hadn't disappeared, it was here. The apartment belonged to someone else now. The walls thrummed with the same web formations he noticed in his nightmares, their lines writhing like veins beneath skin. The air reeked of moist earth, and the thrumming resonated as a pressure in his head, obliterating his thoughts. The ring on his wrist remained the same, but heavier now, as if it were grounding him in a reality other than his own. He hadn't slept since the ritual, and yet he didn't think he was awake, either. The two states were now indistinguishable from each other. He glided through the apartment as a ghost would, skirting away from mirrors and keeping the lights on. The shadows were not shadows any longer. They shifted and sprang across the walls in ways impossible for the light. More marks on his body, faintly at first and deepening, lines tracing his arms, his chest, his legs, like the tendrils of a grasping vine. He would not look at them directly for very long for fear they'd begin crawling like the drawings in his notebook. The library book was all he had to guide him, but the pages were altering. Proverbs and words he'd known were erased and replaced with meaningless phrases in a script he did not recognize. A torn piece of paper bookmarks a single page now. The threshold is open. You are the door. Elias shut the book violently, his hands trembling. He didn't recognize what it said, but it seemed a threat, or a condemnation. He attempted to depart the apartment, hoping a breath of fresh air would clear his mind, but the door would not open. The knob would turn, but the door seemed stuck, as if it were closed by an unseen force. He slammed on it, and yelled for assistance, but the noise disappeared in the thrumming sound. The windows were little better. When he pulled aside the bed sheets, the glass was black, not with night but solidity, as if the chasm in his dreams. He was immobilized. He turned from the recorder, his final attempt at retaining sanity. He talked into it, his words describing the walls, the marks, the hum. He sounded hoarse and unrecognizable. He listened as he played it back, and the recording sounded distorted, his words overlaid by the same rasping whispers from his dream. They were audible now, making words. You brought us here. You cannot close the door. He hurled the recorder against the far side of the room, where it broke on the wall. The pieces did not fall. They hung suspended in the air, and their edges ran together into branching patterns. Desperate as he was, he went back to the ritual. The book instructed him to overcome the entity by overcoming his fear, but fear was all he ever knew at this moment. He relit the candle and watched as the flame trembled as if fighting to survive. He wrapped the ring harder around his wrist, the cord cutting through his skin. He muttered the words once more, although they seemed meaningless now, and closed his eyes and willed himself into the dream. The forest changed this time. The trees were not discrete entities now. They were merged in a single mass of writhing vegetation, their branches tangled overhead and blocking the sun from sight. The shadow in the middle of the clearing stood almost human but grotesquely elongated, the face a suck at the very fabric of the air. The earth disappeared beneath his feet, and was replaced by a mass of black and writhing forms, hands and faces and claws stretching out toward him. The ring grasped in his hand was what held him from unraveling into the darkness. You opened the door, the shadow replied, speaking in a chorus of murmurs that resonated through his mind. You invited us in. I didn't mean to, stammered Elias, his words shaking. I just wanted to stop. The shadow cocked its head at an angle, opening wider the rectangle of its mouth. You're the door, it said. And doors don't choose. The tide of shapes tumbled him beneath the surface. He struggled and screamed, but the hands closed in on him, their grip hard and unforgiving. The ring seared his wrist, and he concentrated on it, trying to visualize his apartment, his life, anything concrete. He snapped out of it with a twisting effort, gasping, and the candle went out. But the apartment was not right. The walls disappeared and were replaced by the forest's gnarled trees. The floor beneath his feet was soft, like the ground in the dream, and the air stank of rot. The shadow loomed in the corner of the room, its smile twisting upward. Elias screamed, backing away on his heels, but there was nowhere to run. The forest had come here or he had gone there. He could not be certain now. He seized the ring and pulled on the string, but it refused to snap. The marks on his flesh pulsed softly, beating in rhythm with the thrum. He understood, with a nauseous certainty, why the ritual hadn't taken hold. He hadn't fought the entity. He was transforming into it. The marks, the thrum, the darkness, they belonged to him now or he belonged to them. The door was not a portal. It was him. Elias could not tell what was real any longer. His apartment, the woods, the shadow, they were all part of a single, crushing reality now. The walls, when they did materialize, were soft and throbbing, their surfaces wriggling with branch patterns which seemed to be breathing. The stench of wet soil and rot filled the air, and the thrumming was a permanent scream in his head that drowned out his thoughts. The silver ring on his wrist his only hold on reality, but even this seemed awry, the metal warm and slippery beneath his skin as if it were a living thing. He hadn't gazed at his reflection in days, not since he'd covered the mirrors. He could sense the changes in his body, however. The marks on his skin extended outward from his arms and chest, covering them in elaborate root-like patterns. They glowed softly in the dark, and they pulsed in syncopation with the thrumming of the machine. His own eyes, when he caught a glimpse of them in a spoon or a sliver of glass, were not his eyes at all. They were far too large and far too dark, like the faces without eyes from the chasm. He couldn't be certain if he was still Elias or anything at all. The shadow persisted now, lurking just out of vision. He caught sight of it in the corner of his eye, its lipless smile twisting, but when he turned to look, it vanished. The whispers persisted now, no longer limited to his dreams. They whispered in his own voice, in voices he didn't know, repeating the words, "You are the door," and "We are one." He attempted to suppress them, but they were in him, insinuating themselves through his mind like roots through earth. He'd given up on trying to escape the apartment. The door persisted, but it opened on nothing. The single time he'd opened it, he'd caught a glimpse of the forest out there, the leaves swaying, the earth crawling with forms. He'd slammed the door shut on his racing heart, and braced it shut with furniture. The forest was already here now. The ground beneath him was soft, the walls were trunks, and everywhere was heavy with the shadows breathing. He sat on what remained of his sofa, holding the ring in his hand. The library book disappeared, its pages flying away on the wind like smoke. He had neither guide nor plan nor even hope now, only the desperate necessity of getting through each moment alive. He recited the book's advice. In order to exorcise the entity, he would have to face his fear. And his fear now included the shadow and the woods and himself. He had no idea how to fight a part of himself. He shut his eyes not in sleep but in concentration. The hum grew stronger and stronger until the forest materialized, even more clearly than before. The shadow stood in front of him now, its form firm and definite, and the void of a mouth swallowing light. The trees throbbed and their branches curved toward him as the ground gaped open and showed him the chasm beneath. The faces were replaced by a single dark infinity calling his name. "You're the door," said the shadow in his own voice. "Open." He clutched the ring, and the heat burned his skin. "I won't," he said, his words shaky but unyielding. "I'm not yours." The shadow's laugh reverberated through the trees. "You already are." The void opened wider, its shadows encasing him like a wave. He began to slip away, his form melting from his own body and dissolving into darkness. But the ring pulsed harder now, a stinging ache that grounded him. He concentrated on it, on the recollection of his mother's voice and on the life he'd known before the nightmares. He was not the door. He was Elias. With a yelp he ripped the ring off his wrist, the cord snapping. The forest trembled, the shadow contracting as the rift started closing in on itself. He ran, not in the forest but in his own apartment, the walls firm, the air fresh. He got as far as the door and pushed it open and tumbled out into the hallway, the buzzing dying away behind him. He fell to the ground, gasping, the ring clutched in his hand. The marks on his skin disappeared, his own eyes returning. The shadow vanished from sight. As he sat there, trying to catch his breath, he heard it, a soft hum, and it appeared to be from the ring. He released it and sat and watched as it skittered on the ground and came to rest, the surface glowing softly with branching designs. Elias got up on shaking legs and walked away from the ring. He did not turn around. He could not. Because in his heart of hearts he knew the truth. The door stood ajar and the shadow waited.